Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this session. My name is Zane. I'm a PhD student at the University of Illinois, and I'm here today to present some work on the Mirai Botnet that I did in collaboration with a small army of researchers from Akamai, Cloudflare, Georgia Tech, Google, Merit Network, the University of Illinois, and the University of Michigan. So the Mirai Botnet came to prominence in October 2016 when it was responsible for a DDoS attack that took down many large web services, including Twitter, Netflix, PayPal, etc. And it was noteworthy not only for its disruptive impact, but also because it was reportedly composed of IoT devices such as IP cameras and DVRs. And Mirai's IoT composition is worrying because there's already an estimated 6 to 9 billion IoT devices on the internet, and that number is expected to grow to about 30 billion by 2020. And so as researchers, we were naturally attracted to studying this botnet for three reasons. First, we wanted to snapshot the IoT botnet phenomenon as a reference point for future researchers. Second, we were fortunate enough to coordinate with a wide range of data partners, and we wanted to combine their different perspectives to conduct a more nuanced and cross-validated approach to understanding the Mirai botnet. And lastly, we wanted to understand kind of the mechanisms and motives behind Mirai. So not just how it works, but going a step deeper and trying to understand what are the motivations behind Mirai so that we can learn something about how to combat Mirai moving forward, and IoT botnets in general. So I'm going to start with a description kind of how Mirai works, a rough outline. And so Mirai begins its propagation through rapid scanning. So the bot sends fingerprintable scan packets to pseudo-random IPv4 addresses in order to find devices that are accessible by Telnet and are using weak or default passwords from a hard-coded password dictionary. Once it finds these vulnerable devices, it reports them to a report server, which dispatches this information to a loader. The loader is what actually downloads the Mirai binary onto infected devices. After infection, at some later point in time, an attacker will send commands to command and control servers, also known as C2s. And these C2 servers will relay these commands to the botnets that they control, and then the bots will actually send attack traffic to the DDoS targets. So to understand this sort of multifaceted process, we employ a number of different data sources. First, we have a network telescope of unused IP addresses that allows us to observe fingerprintable Mirai scan packets. We use active scanning to actually try to determine what these infected devices are. We use Telnet honeypots to collect binaries in the wild. And we supplement this malware binary collection with additional binaries from VirusTotal, which is a large malware repository. We use actively collected DNS data from seed lists and passively collected DNS data generated by DNS queries at a large ISP to measure C2 domain activity and to identify DDoS targets. We use C2 milkers to monitor the issuance of different attacks from these C2 centers. And finally, we're able to get a list of attack IPs for two of Mirai's high-profile targets, the first being a popular security blog called Krebs on Security, and the second is Dyn, a DNS hosting service. So across all our data sets, we have data from about a 7-month period from July 2016 to February 2017. And so with this wealth of data perspectives in hand, the first question that we try to answer is, what is Mirai? What is Mirai botnet? And to answer that question, from our network telescope, we first start to observe scanning packets with the Mirai fingerprint to get a representative estimate of the population size of Mirai. And so our network telescope actually provides very high visibility into Mirai, since it's large enough that we would expect with about 99% confidence to detect a single scanner operating at 10 kilobytes per second within about 36 seconds. So this is across the entire internet. And in fact, we were actually able to detect the origins of Mirai using our network telescope. So Mirai begins on August 1st from a single scanning IP located at a US bulletproof hosting provider. And this original scanner scans for about 2 hours, at which point it stops, and then we see a subsequent burst of 25,000 Mirai scanners. That eventually grows to 64,000 devices within the first day of scanning. And after this bootstrapping phase, we see Mirai expand its reach by scanning on ports beyond the customary telnet port, which is port 23. So in early September 2016, we see Mirai begins to target port 2323, which is kind of colloquially known as the telnet port for IoT. So that's it. And in addition to scanning for new ports, we see that over time, Mirai also starts scanning for new protocols. Most notably, we see Mirai scanning for port 7547, which is commonly used by a protocol known as CWMP, which is kind of a router management protocol. And we note that this exploit is different from the default telnet logins exploit that was present in the original version of Mirai, and that this infection mechanism, this new infection mechanism, was able to increase Mirai infections to a peak of over 600,000 bots. But encouragingly, we do see that this population growth due to CWMP is short-lived. We find that within a month, the number of bots scanning on port 7547 is reduced to about 2% of peak CWMP scanning. So this suggests that there's rapid patching by network operators and device vendors that actually leads to effective results. Mirai is not just, does not just scan ports 2323 and CWMP. It also expands to target 9 other protocols throughout our study period. And we find that it does this with differing levels of effect. And so while they don't really impact the size of Mirai, they highlight kind of the dynamic nature of the Mirai malware and how it constantly changes over time. So taking a step back, when we look across all protocols that Mirai scans for, we find that Mirai achieves a steady state population between 200,000 to 300,000 bots. This is actually somewhat modest in terms of IoT botnet size when we compare it to the Karna IoT botnet, which was about 420,000 bots. But it's still surprising to us that about 200,000 devices can be compromised by a very trivial attack vector that's exploiting default passwords. Yeah, it's something that we didn't expect. And furthermore, that these 200 to 300,000 vulnerable devices were sufficient to disrupt many of the large internet services on the internet. To kind of dig a little deeper into what is Mirai actually made of, we looked at the geographic distribution of Mirai. We were surprised to find that there are large concentrations of Mirai bots in South America and Southeast Asia. And this is in contrast to some other non-IoT botnets such as TDSS, TDL4, which is more globally distributed, which is more localized in North America and Europe. And the globally distributed nature of Mirai suggests that some sort of concerted global effort across multiple network operators and device distributors is likely required in order to really solve this problem. And the final and most challenging step in our attempt to answer the question, what is Mirai, was to try to identify the actual devices that were being infected. So we took 2 approaches to this. The first approach was to look at, okay, based off of the password dictionaries in Mirai binaries, what devices are being targeted by Mirai. And then we also looked at the devices that are being infected by Mirai. And the way that we did this is we scanned these bots for different protocol banners and analyzed these banners for identifying information. So for example, some Mirai bots would run an HTTPS server that returned a camera login page, for example. And what we find is that there's pretty good alignment between what Mirai is targeting and what it's actually infecting, with most things being cameras and DVRs, followed by routers. I will note, however, that there's a substantial number of devices that we actually could not identify due to some sort of generic banners or just missing no information about these things, and that this is an area for future research. So after getting a sense of kind of the prevalence and composition of Mirai, the next question that we wanted to ask was, who's actually operating this thing? Who's behind this? And to begin to answer this question, we looked at the C2 infrastructure that was responsible for controlling Mirai. So what we did is we extracted C2 domains from our binary collection and used the DNS datasets we had to correlate domains through shared DNS infrastructure. And this process yielded 33 disjoint clusters of independent C2 infrastructure, suggesting the possibility of actual multiple independent actors who are controlling different bots within the Mirai botnet. And while these clusters, and while these clusters provide a sense of the complexity of the C2 infrastructure that is running them, it doesn't actually indicate the number of bots controlled by each of these clusters. And when we dig deeper, we turn to our passive DNS dataset to find the number of times each cluster's C2 domains were looked up by devices within our ISP partners. So what we find is that there's a lot of different spikes and peaks for these clusters, but really there's kind of three large clusters that we care about. The first one is cluster number 1, and this is the original botnet, and this is the cluster that's actually responsible for attacking Krebs. We have cluster number 2, which is actually the most complex botnet from a C2 infrastructure perspective, and this is also the one that evolves to start scanning for CWMP. And we also see cluster number 6, which is arguably kind of the largest cluster and is the one that attacked Dyn. So another approach that we took to try to, so C2 infrastructure is suggestive that, hey, there's multiple operators, but we wanted to take another approach to figure out, how many people are actually behind this. And so we took another approach to identify these actors by looking at evidence of divergent strains of Mirai binaries. And so what we did is we extracted the password dictionaries from all of these binaries, and we found 48 unique password dictionaries. And we linked them by shared passwords, so you can kind of get a sense of the evolutionary progress of these binaries. And what we find is, branching out from the source code release node, there are several independent divergences from this password dictionary in the Mirai that we observe. And when we annotate these actually with the C2 infrastructure clusters, we find a rough alignment between divergent password dictionaries and independent C2 clusters. We also note that in addition to looking at password evolution, we find Mirai strains with avoidance techniques such as binary packing and DGA. And these are all tied to cluster 2, but not of any of the other clusters. So having kind of looked at what Mirai is and gotten a sense of the complexity of the multiple actors behind it, the final question that we were really interested in answering is, how was Mirai used? And the short answer is it was used for DDoS. The first target that Mirai kind of took down that was a high-profile target was Krebs on security. And Mirai's attack on Krebs on security reached about 623 gigabits per second. And this was not only the largest attack ever seen against Krebs on security, it was also the largest DDoS attack ever publicly recorded. So again, we'd like to reiterate, this is an extremely surprising result that this modest botnet of about 250,000 bots was able to launch kind of the largest DDoS attack ever publicly reported. Another victim of Mirai's DDoS attacks that was quite high profile is Dyn. And due to the widespread impact of the Dyn attack, there was a lot of speculation as to who the actors were that were behind this. So some people said, hey, perhaps it's criminal groups. Maybe it's political hacktivists. Maybe it's foreign nation-state entities. And the reason for the speculation is because the Dyn attack was quite impactful, and it took down sites like GitHub, PayPal, Spotify, etc. But when we look at the attack monitoring data from our C2 milkers, what we see is that attacks on Dyn simultaneously attacked 6 IPs. And when we do a reverse DNS lookup of these IPs, we actually find that surprisingly only 4 of them are related to Dyn infrastructure. So this kind of puzzled us, and we dug a little deeper, and using our passive DNS data set, we were able to actually figure out that these IPs map very cleanly to a set of PlayStation name server infrastructure. So, this pattern of behavior suggests that the Dyn attacker was driven perhaps by gaming motivations, and that they were actually attempting to take down PlayStation, and Dyn just happened to be an unintended casualty. So, this is further supported by our observation that these attacks issued against Dyn were actually interspersed with attacks against other gaming-related infrastructure, such as Xbox and other game hosts. But kind of moving beyond Dyn, when we take a look at attacks in general, we find that Mirai does target booter-like sites. So some of the top targets that Mirai goes for are games like Minecraft, political sites for Chinese political dissidents, regional politicians, anti-DDoS services, which is very characteristic of booter attacks, and also kind of miscellaneous, really random things that we couldn't attribute, like this Russian cooking blog. And so while the DDoS targets, the targets of Mirai paint this picture of booter, we actually find that Mirai's DDoS methods are slightly unconventional. So first, compared to global DDoS attacks that are primarily volumetric in nature, Mirai employs fewer volumetric methods and actually attempts more TCP state exhaustion and application level attacks. So this is against the trend. Secondly, we see this interesting attack on the Valve source engine game server, which is an uncommon application level attack that hints again at this gaming-related motivation behind kind of the Mirai attackers. And finally, we note that of all the attacks that Mirai issues, only 3% of these are reflection and amplification attacks. So this is in stark contrast to typical booter behavior, which often uses reflection and amplification to obscure the source of attacks and increase the impact of their attacks. So as a high-level overview, what did we find? What is Mirai? It's about 200 to 300,000 bots that are globally distributed across and are compromised by default telnet credentials. We find evidence of multiple operators are actually behind this. And Mirai, in terms of its motivation, seems to be a booter-like service that just happens to be responsible for some of the largest attacks on record. And while DDoS is Mirai's flavor of abuse, future versions of Mirai or future IoT botnets might be used for other, perhaps more malicious purposes. So to conclude this talk, I actually want to take a step back and take a reflective look at some of the lessons that I think Mirai has taught us about IoT security. And kind of the common theme here is that IoT is this new dog that we have to teach the same tricks to. So Mirai has highlighted the fact that a lot of these IoT devices are not learning the lessons that we've learned already in desktop security or web security. An example of this is security hardening. So I think IoT needs to embrace practices commonly used in the web, such as requiring secure non-default passwords. We need to close ports that are not being used. IoT devices in the IoT ecosystem could benefit from automatic updates. So as we saw prior, the rapid decline of CWMP after an initial affection period was pretty encouraging, and this is likely due to the action of network operators like Deutsche Telekom, who were able to patch this problem very rapidly. And so we need to think about how to incorporate these automatic updates into IoT devices while taking into consideration the potential resource constraints that these devices have. Another area for focus is improving device attribution. So as part of this study, we wanted to actually try to figure out what was being infected. And we had a very difficult time. So we started out with 55.4 million scanning IP addresses, of which we could extract 1.8 million protocol banners. And of those banners, we were actually able to label about a third of them. And so this is a really challenging topic. And without effective ways to identify different internet endpoints, I think in the future we'll have a difficult time figuring out who's responsible for future security problems and how do we actually fix them. And lastly, there's this issue of end of life. So we talked about how there's already about 6 to 9 billion IoT devices connected to the internet, and that number is expected to grow to about 30 billion in the future. And as IoT grows in the years to come, we'll be left with this sort of aging population of devices that will likely be neglected by device manufacturers as they focus on newer products, and the new hot smart fridge or something. But these devices will still be connected to the internet and likely vulnerable to exploitation by future malware. And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
Thanks, Zane. We have plenty of time for questions, and don't forget to state your name and affiliation. We'll start here.
Hi, I'm Brad Reeves at NC State. This is a great talk and great work. My question has to do with one of your very last comments. You said that we need to be careful over time as new devices come online, that maybe the old ones won't get patched or taken care of. I was curious if, when you were doing your device attribution, you were able to get any sense of the relative age of some of these devices. So we've had IP cameras for 20 years. How old was the stuff that you were seeing?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we didn't feel like we had enough identification to get a representative number for that. We had model information, specific model information for a very small subset of these devices. And for a lot of them, there are more generic labels like, oh, we know this is a camera, we know it's manufactured by this person, but we don't actually know how old it is. But yeah, that's definitely an interesting area of future work as well. Thanks.
Hey, Alex Kampman from Qualcomm. So did it all spread through credential reuse, or did you see any evidence of actual exploitation of implementation vulnerabilities?
Yeah, so the one example that comes to mind is CWMP. So this is actually a separate exploit from Telnet credentials that did a remote code execution through this sort of HTTP-based router management protocol. We didn't look too deeply into all the binaries and try to figure out the exact exploits that were done by each one. And there have been reports of other types of exploits. But as we stated, we find that most of these other variants that are trying other exploits on other ports didn't seem to have much of an effect on the overall population size of Mirai.
Yeah, all right, thanks.
Yep.
Hi, Susan McGregor, Columbia Journalism School. So you pointed out that this was a really trivial attack vector. And part of me is, and one of the things I'm wondering is, should we make it harder? Right? In other words, should we make this a more difficult attack vector? And specifically, I'm thinking of, basically policy or regulation that says, you need to have variation in this, as you said, point out best practices on the web. Do we need to enforce that? And it makes, I'm wondering, I'm thinking of this in the context of something like the General Data Protection Regulation, where downstream operators are actually held responsible for, essentially the supply chain. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. I think that, yes, we should hold these IoT device manufacturers to a higher standard in terms of the software that they're putting out onto the web. And that, while there's usually these concerns about, hey, we can't actually do this security feature because we're resource constrained, I think default passwords, avoiding default passwords is one of those things that seems like it's pretty easy to do, and it doesn't run into this issue. In terms of the regulatory side of things, it's a very complex environment, and even I don't understand all the complexities behind it. But I do think that regulation in this field can help. But I think we have to be very careful about not implementing regulations that incentivize kind of, behavior that we're not looking for. So, for example, you think about PCI compliance and stuff like that, where it doesn't. Sometimes it actually makes things less secure. So it's definitely a tricky area, and I think there's a lot of future work that needs to go into looking at that.
Thank you.
August Reduce Google. The composition of the botnet seems weird. It didn't seem to track distribution of sort of how much internet usage there is, and that combined with the DDoS power per bot seems to be higher. Did you look at, for instance, how the distribution geographic of the botnet corresponds to, say, IoT device distribution, and also the IP address distribution of residential versus commercial, industrial, academic?
Yeah. So we did do kind of we try to contextualize the IoT distribution across all IoT on the internet, but we kind of ran into the same problem of not being able to conclusively identify, what's IoT, what's not IoT. And so I think, that's something that we'd like to do in the future so that we can actually kind of trace down who's guilty in some sense of this problem. And but yeah, definitely interesting area.
What about IP addresses? Was it more residential, more industrial?
Yeah, it was very residential. So a lot of the ISPs in these in South America and Southeast Asia were just large telecom, like commercial operators.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Yeah, hi, Phoebe Rouge, the FTC. In your research, did anything point towards things that could make device attribution easier? And if that is a device manufacturer thing, an ISP thing, or what are the ways that we can increase our ability to attribute who are the manufacturers of these devices, so we can tell them how to fix it?
Yeah. Let me think. Nothing kind of popped out immediately. It's a very, very messy data set with everyone doing their own thing. People running SSH on the telnet ports or like FTP and all sorts of stuff. So we didn't see anything kind of uniform that suggested an easy solution to this problem. I will say though that I think there's probably interest outside of security. For example, I think ISPs are interested to know what devices are being connected to their networks, so that when attacks are launched, they have some sense of who is this coming from and why, what am I representing as an ISP? So, yeah, nothing comes to mind immediately, but I think that's something that we can look at. Thanks.
Great. I'll take the chair's privilege and ask one final question. So it's surprising that you observed amplification techniques weren't used to a large extent, yet we had, in terms of gigabits per second, one of the largest recorded botnets. So can you speak to that seeming tension and what made this, such a large and impactful botnet?
Well, I think a couple things. One is that, with the global, kind of global increase of total internet bandwidth across, connecting different countries and entities. There's just more resources available on the internet now, and technology is getting better and technology is getting faster. And so part of the size of the attacks was a natural consequence of, this improvement in internet traffic.
Great. Let's thank Zane again.